Hi, I'm Rob, and I'd like to welcome you to this video where we'll build a full-stack RAG app with Amazon Bedrock using knowledge bases and OpenSearch and FastAPI and Streamlit. Well, to be clear, we're actually only going to build the FastAPI and Streamlit UI in this video because I walked through how to create and test all the AWS resources in the prior video in the playlist. So if you haven't watched that yet, I'd recommend pausing here, watching that video, then coming back. So we'll pick up here with the Amazon Bedrock knowledge base deployed and synced with the data in an S3 bucket, a Lambda function deployed to hit the knowledge base, and an API gateway fronting the Lambda. Now let's take a look at the README for this project. As previously stated, the prereq is to have completed the steps in the prior video, so I'll assume you've done that and are ready to continue. So let's scroll down to the backend setup section. I'll start by launching a terminal and changing into the backend directory for the project. I've already created a UV virtual environment using this command, so I'll skip that step and activate it. Then run UV pip install, passing it the requirements.txt file to install the required libraries for the backend FastAPI server. Now, you'll need to make a copy of the .env.example file, save it as .env, and add the endpoint to your API gateway. Now we can launch the server and hit the docs endpoint in a browser. Next, I'll launch a terminal for the front end, follow the similar steps, making a copy of this .env.example and populating the endpoint to the backend FastAPI server, which should be port 8000 unless you've changed it when you deploy. Then launch the Streamlit app and hit that in a browser. And I'll just click the Ask button without entering a question, and we see that's working. Now let's jump back into FastAPI docs in the browser and test the query post route. I'll enter a question for the query parameter value, then execute. And we see our response. So let's head back over to the UI, enter the same prompt, and click Ask. And again, we see our response with sources displayed. All right, now that we've tested the app, we'll jump back into Cursor and take a look at the backend server code. And just a note that if you're done playing around with the app and want to limit your expenses on AWS, be sure to destroy your resources, especially the OpenSearch collection. I cover that at the end of the prior video in the playlist. Okay, so here in Cursor, looking at the code in the backend folder, first we have the requirements text file, and these are the libraries that we need for the FastAPI server. And the API.py file is the server itself. So first we start with our imports, of course from FastAPI and Pydantic for the models. We'll call load.env to load the .env file and get the value from the API URL in the .env file to populate the API gateway URL. Then we'll instantiate an instance of the FastAPI app and define models for the query request and query response. Here we're defining the post query route for the app, setting the response model equal to the query response. And the query function takes a request, which is a query request type. So when this endpoint is hit, we'll try to make a post using the request library to the API gateway URL, passing JSON with a property of query and the value equal to the query property in the request. Then we'll call raise for status on the response, and when the response comes back, we'll get the JSON and store it in data. Then we'll return a query response object with the query property set to the query property in the request, and the generated response set to the generated response property in the response. And we'll also pass the S3 locations so we can identify the resources the model used to generate the response. And of course, if any exceptions are raised from trying to code in this block, we'll handle them down here. So that's all the code for the backend FastAPI server. Now let's look at the front end Streamlit app. So again, we have the requirements.txt file on the right and the app.py file, which is the main Streamlit app. Of course, we'll start with our imports, then call load.env, set the value of the FastAPI URL equal to the value in the .env file. Then we'll call set page config on Streamlit, setting the page title and the page icon and center the layout. Then we've defined a style sheet for the page. We're calling title on Streamlit, setting the title on the page as well as the caption. Now we're defining our query, which will populate in a text area, and then we define 2 columns. And in the first column, we'll add a button, which will handle the submit request. Or in our case, the button says ask. We'll display a warning if there's no query entered into the text area. Else, we'll try the main page logic by making a post to the FastAPI backend, hitting the query endpoint, sending JSON with a query property and the query value, which is equal to the text that we've entered into the text area. We'll wait for the response, and when the response comes back, we'll get the data, then grab the generated response from the data, store in answer, and the S3 locations in the S3 location variable. Then we'll display the answer on the page, and then if we have S3 locations, for each location, we'll display that on the page as well, and of course handle any exceptions if anything goes wrong in that logic. And that's all the code for the Streamlit UI. So that concludes this video on building a FastAPI backend and a Streamlit frontend to interact with the Bedrock RAG knowledge base that we created in the prior video. If you found it interesting, feel free to give it a like. And if you'd like to be notified when I add more content to the channel, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.